I'm very happy to be here this evening to, I guess, be the last panel of this very wonderful conference. Just a little bit of background on myself, very, very briefly, because this is not at all about me. But my background is primarily in narrative, although I've also worked a little bit in documentary. Started in development, working on The Thin Red Line. Produced a feature film, wrote and directed a feature, produced another feature, and gradually over time started working a little bit more in nonfiction, did quite a bit of work with the military community here in Washington, which became the inspiration for my current screenplay. And I became interested in the overlap and the intersection between documentary and fiction, which is why I'm particularly excited about today's panel. I do teach here at American. I teach screenwriting and directing, and it is my honor to introduce our esteemed panelists here. Next to me is Lisa Cortes, the executive producer of Precious. Closer? Really? You may have heard of the film. It won numerous awards, including 5 Independent Spirit Awards, the Sundance Audience and Jury Awards, and 2 Academy Awards for Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Supporting Actress. Lisa's worked on several other features, including The Woodsman and Shadowboxer, and she recently started her own company, Cortes Films, which has several projects in development. So thank you, Lisa, for being here. Next to her, John Schreiber is the Executive Vice President of Social Action and Advocacy at Participant Media. This is the production company behind such diverse and socially minded films as The Soloist, Syriana, An Inconvenient Truth, Charlie Wilson's War, and most recently, Food Inc. and The Cove. We're very happy to have him here with us today. Thank you. And finally, Meg Myers is the Executive Director of Meaningful Media, a nonprofit network committed to changing the world through media. Its mission is to increase the quality, visibility, and impact of social issue media. Emily is also president of Eyes of the World Group, which specializes in producing socially relevant media for organizations like the United Nations, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, PBS, and UCLA. So thank you all for being here. What I would like to do is each panelist has prepared a 10 to 15 minute presentation telling you a little bit about their background and some work that they'd like to discuss with you here today. And then what I'd like to do is, if there are no really pressing questions, I'd like to let them each present what they've brought in and then broaden the conversation to some larger questions about how fiction films can affect change, how can we measure that impact, how have they developed community outreach, and then more particularly, how are fiction films, how do they operate differently than documentary, or in what ways are they similar to documentaries in reaching their audiences and affecting change? So without further ado, let's hear a little bit from Lisa.
Great. Well, first of all, I want to thank the Center for Social Media. This has been an incredible day, and I was a little scared to be on the last panel, but I'm kind of excited right now. So I want to give all of you a big hand.
That's right.
Can you show the trailer, please? Thank you. You know, when I got here this morning, I said, what am I doing here? I listened to the presentation on the reckoning, and I thought, Precious, documentary filmmaking, media that matters. What is the intersection? And what's interesting is that as an independent filmmaker, I'm in the same boat as our documentarians. I'm continuously looking for stories that I think shed and broaden representation of what, as a balance to the kind of McDonald's that we're served all the time. I like to liken Precious to being the spinach salad of McDonald's. I'm looking for funding and community And, you know, I think a consistent theme that we've heard today is about early outreach and engagement. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the partners that we developed along the way. But then I went back in the time machine to my first career, which was in the music industry. When I graduated from college, I kind of stumbled into a little company called Def Jam Records, and I was a part of the original team of Def Jam Records and also the management company, Rush. This was a company founded by Russell Simmons, and it launched the careers of the Beastie Boys and Run DMC and Houdini and LL Cool J, and also unleashed hip-hop culture on the world. And I was very lucky to be a part of a team who just believed in this voice and this movement, and started at this concept, which is, I call it, you know, how do I get into the house, which is how I make a film. So I would love to go in the front door, but oftentimes I can't find the keys. So it is, you know, and this is how we make our projects. It might be about, you know, parachuting in through the roof, or coming in through the back window, or digging a tunnel. But it's that type of tenacity that is incredibly important to moving our projects forward. And it's also about finding a community to help us to do this, because it oftentimes seems like a Sisyphean, which is the hardest word to say, task to move things forward. But so in between my several cups of coffee during the day, it kind of all coalesced that, you know, there is this common thread of the narratives that I have been drawn to, the focused energy that it takes to move them forward when people look at you and say, you're going to make a movie about a 300-pound African-American girl, and you want me to be in it, and you're not going to give me any money. Well, yeah. And I guess the lunacy that I wrapped all of these things in. In 1996, I at that point was an executive in the music industry. I ran a label at Polygram called Loose Cannon, and I happened to read this book. And the first person that I always have to thank is Sapphire, because this movie would not have been made if she had not written such a moving testament to the young girls that she was working with at the time. And I read this book, and I just thought, like, wow, I love how she has given voice to somebody that I see around me all the time in New York. And I realized how funny and wry and smart Precious was, and the role that community played in allowing her to advance and kind of break a chain of violence that she lived within. I saw echoes of it's my movie, it's my life, it's my movie, it's my life, that, you know, in this, and I became intoxicated with it. At the same time, Lee Daniels, the director of the film, who's a very old friend of mine who was managing talent at the time, read the book, and we were obsessed with it. It wasn't until 2005 that we were actually able to convince Sapphire to allow us to option the project. But you know, people said, why did you want to make this movie? Well, I think, you know, it's always the story. It's so distinctive. And it was characters that I was not used to seeing in any form of media. But also, you know, I was talking with Elizabeth Alexander, who's the professor of African American Studies Department at Yale, and, you know, she said, this movie allows us to show the complexity of our female body. You know, it is not just about the external and how Precious moves to the world and how people react to her, but it's also the internal. It's that complexity of the character that was something that was really important to me. Obviously, broadening representation of images and voices was something that, you know, as when I moved into film, starting with Monsters Ball, the first film our company produced, to The Woodsman, which is about, you know, a pedophile returning to his community and trying to come to terms with his past. I've always been attracted to to stories that I think look at redemption from the most unlikely places. And so, you know, some people say, what does an executive producer do? Well, I basically am the mocker. You know, I'm there from conception to christening. The role of convincing Sapphire that this would be a good home for her project, to finding Precious, which was not an easy task at all, because when you go to Hollywood and say, this is what I'm looking for, they say, well, what about Raven-Symoné? Now, Raven-Symoné is very talented and she's beautiful, but she is not our character. And you know, and I think what's a continuous thread here with documentary filmmakers is an authentic voice. You know, we wanted to make certain that we, you know, were true to this character and to show her beauty. And we were very lucky to find Gabby, who is, I was telling someone at lunch today how many people at Sundance said to her, it must have been so hard to tell your story in this movie. And she was like, well, no, actually I'm a junior in college, and I love my mother, and my dad is great, and you know, but it was, there was something about, you know, her and finding her that was just like such a blessing. We were basically 2 weeks away from shooting, and the director said, oh, the person I have is not going to work. And I was like, well, we could do this, we could do that. And he said no. And so we went out and we found her right up the street after having searched the entire world. It seemed like, I'm not going to tell you the places we did casting calls. But so as an executive producer, basically shepherding the project, you know, finding both above the line and below the line talent, making certain that, you know, there were people of color and women who were involved in every aspect of this. It's something that's really important to me. The post-process, this film actually has over 300 digital effects because to create New York of 1986 is difficult for a couple of reasons. A lot of the graffiti and mess is gone, so we had to like kind of, you know, you see graffiti on the subways and the schools, etc. And also, we would go on locations, and this film is kind of has a documentarian aspect in that, like M&G's, a place where she steals the fried chicken, is actually closed, and they're going to build a condo now. We would go to a location and then come back to shoot, and they'd be tearing it down, and they'd be putting up a condo. And we shot in Harlem, in the Bronx, in Brooklyn. So there's many parts of New York, one that we tried to recreate, and also there are aspects of the New York, which I feel is a character in the film and in the novel, that no longer exists. You know, what also is really important about this project to me is that there's so many themes, from literacy to teenage pregnancy, sexual abuse, neglect, that were a part of the dialogue in '86 and continue, unfortunately, to be a part of the dialogue of what we're looking at now. And, you know, I mean, this film has had its moments of controversy. Not everyone has embraced it. Someone said to me, you know, why are you airing our dirty laundry? Well, a couple of reasons. One, because I like to stir stuff up. And I wanted to present a work that you know, when I look at the films that were released in 2009 and the images of people of color, you know, it's great we were a princess. It's great that we were an obsessive, you know, that movie Obsession with Beyonce. But I thought that, you know, it was incredibly lacking. And this film, you know, did stimulate dialogue, whether you liked it or not. Traveling around the world to support it, I also found that the dialogue and the identification with the themes and the characters went beyond race. They went beyond class, and that it was pretty eye-opening to have conversations in Salt Lake City with 60-year-old Caucasian ladies who said, you know what, this was my story also. The same thing happened in Spain and numerous other countries, you know, that I could go into greater detail about. So I think ultimately that for me is that Precious is a canvas to explore brutal and urgent issues that are facing our society. She is a character that allows us to witness hope in the face of hopelessness, courage under the most frightening circumstances, and a sense of purpose when one is taught to be worthless. We can be afraid or we can be scared by the film, or we can affect change. And a lot of the conversations that I've had with communities and different organizations has been about how whether you are in an entertainment or in education, what you can do to affect change in your own way. And I guess that is why we are on this panel today, and hopefully we'll have a dialogue with you guys about some of the tools that we all create to further our messages.
Okay. Before I show our little video, I want to say two things to Lisa. One is, the word Sisyphean is one of the great words, and if you can say it correctly, you'll get a free copy of Precious and Food Inc., okay, before you, okay. And the other thing is, what Lisa and her colleagues did was amazingly brave, and to succeed the way they did is, I think, unfortunately extraordinary. What they did was take a movie that, on the face of it, had a very limited audience and a potentially limited distribution platform, and they turned it into a worldwide phenomenon. I am embarrassed to say that I was at a screening of the film in Culver City for distributors a couple of years ago, and there's a bunch of white guys in the audience, and at that screening, nobody picked up the rights. Okay? Nobody picked up the rights. But Lisa and her colleagues kept at it, and that's what happens when you keep at it and you have an amazing vision and you have the ability to, with directors and other creatives, to make an amazing film. So what you did is hard to do, and you deserve lots of congratulations for it.
Thank you.
Okay. So let me show the participant greatest hits, and then we'll go from there. On behalf of all those filmmakers, thank you. So we're here today to talk about social action and advocacy as it relates to narrative films. And first, I'll tell you, we're very lucky at Participant because we have a founder-funder in Jeff Skoll who believes that a double bottom line in the movie business is an okay thing, and that is to produce films that are entertaining, that talk about issues in a meaningful way, and as importantly, are used through social action campaigns as an agent of awareness, education, citizen action, legislative advocacy, and sometimes, if we're really lucky, solutions. Our goal with Participant is not to make $1 zillion, but to be sustainable so that we can continue to make these films and tell these stories. With documentarians, they come to us with a tremendous sense of urgency about the issue that they're making their films about. And that informs not only the filmmaking, it also informs the development of our social action campaigns. When one has a filmmaker like Alex Gibney or Davis Guggenheim or Errol Morris, and they are making films about issues that are life and death issues to them, they want to engage with us in the development of the social action campaign around the movie. It's easier, much easier, to get messaging out as it relates to social action in a doc than it is in a feature. The challenge is that the audiences for docs are exponentially smaller in general than they are for features. So it's important for us that our docs get into market, that they stay in market for as long as we can reasonably keep them there. And if we're able to do that, a conversation can gain momentum and our social action can take root and grow. We operate our social action campaigns across several platforms: pre-theatrical, theatrical, DVD, broadcast, and then what we call legacy. We have social action campaigns that have been in operation for 3, 4, 5 years. The Social Action Campaign for an Inconvenient Truth is still operating now around the world. With features, the challenge is to develop social action that complements the film but does not, in certain cases, get in the way of the traditional theatrical marketing of a film. I'll give you an example. We were involved in a movie called The Informant this past year. It tells the story of Mark Whitaker, who blew the whistle on a international price-fixing scheme that Archer Daniels Midland was at the center of. At the same time, Mark Whitaker was stealing $14 million from Archer Daniels Midland. So Steven Soderbergh told that story as a comedy. Social action and whistleblowing is not funny. There's nothing about whistleblowing. It is dangerous. You need to be very brave, and you need to be willing to sacrifice your career, sometimes your family, and your life is in danger sometimes with whistleblowing. So we made a decision with Warner Brothers that the initial marketing of this movie, social action was not going to be engaged in that. We were going to hold our social action activities until the movie got to DVD. And that's what we did. In collaboration with the DVD release of the movie, we created an event with the Paley Center in New York where we brought together 8 whistleblowers, including Daniel Ellsberg and Frank Serpico and Colleen Rowley. And we live streamed an event that we wrote and produced with the Government Accountability Project, where we essentially explained what whistleblowing was, and we used the real-life stories of these whistleblowers. Over 14,000 people tuned into that live stream, and now that film is being used by Gap in their training sessions around the country. Out of that, we are now applying for foundation grants so that we can take a program like that on the road to colleges across the country with something that we're calling a Whistleblower Film Festival. Not only our film, but also movies like The China Syndrome, The Insider, and Aaron Brockovich, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the opportunity we have with The Informant is to take a movie that is a sort of a neurotic comedy, right? And use it as a vehicle to educate a larger public about whistleblowing and how an individual can change the world by virtue of their behavior. That's one example. I'll give you another one, and that is The Visitor, which is a film by Tom McCarthy. The Visitor is my favorite participant movie. It is a beautiful piece of work. It is understated, and yet it's really powerful. And what it does, in my opinion, is it tells the story and explains the nature of present-day immigration problems. And at the same time, it's this beautiful story of friendship. It's also a love story. The performances, Richard Jenkins was brilliant in it. And Tom McCarthy did this movie because he wanted not only to tell a beautiful story, but he wanted to tell the world about the current state of immigration and detention. He researched at detention centers up and down the East Coast before he wrote the movie. And we had early meetings with him at our office where he said, now, I got the movie, now what are you going to do? And we worked with a variety of immigration rights organizations, NGOs, and we came up with an idea that the movie could be used as a catalyst to train lawyers to represent detainees at bond hearings. And so we worked with an NGO, we worked with a foundation, OSI, and we created a CLE, Continuing Legal Education curriculum. And since the movie's release, we've trained around the country 700 lawyers to represent detainees at bond hearings, using the movie sort of as the catalyst for, as the sort of the carrot, you know, the come on to get people to show up at these trainings. We have now gotten funding for that program from a foundation so that that program can continue on for the next 3 years. And over the next 3 years, we'll train another 600 lawyers as a result of that movie. So that, to me, is an example of the possibilities that a narrative film can offer a social action activity, simply because the nature of the distribution is that much greater. And in success, if we're smart and we're creative and we work with the right partners, the brand visibility of a feature gives us many more opportunities to reach people. I'll give you another example, which is less likely, and I'll show the trailer right now. Can you show the Crazies trailer?
Different genre.
Okay, raise your hands. How many of you saw Food, Inc.? Okay. How many of you saw The Crazies? I rest my case. Okay. The Crazies is a remake of a George Romero film from 1973. Now, you know George Romero. You know he's very politically aware. He made his movies with political agendas long before there was any participant media. And we decided that we would go outside of our comfort zone and we would get involved in a movie. We'd get involved in a horror thriller, and everyone said, "How dare you, participant? Don't you know? Don't do that. You'll ruin everything." And we looked at the film and we looked at the issues around the film. We spoke with Romero, and the basic premise of the movie is that biotoxins get into the groundwater of this small town in Iowa, and everybody, starts going crazy. And that was the basis for, the rest of the 89 minutes of the movie. Now, that's a movie that is an R movie. Its core audience are boys of 18 to 24, and then fans of the genre. And we said to ourselves, what can we do there? And how can we make that movie relevant? And it wasn't that hard. We started talking to Greenpeace, and Greenpeace has been involved in so many things, but one of the areas that they've focused on is chemical insecurity. And we decided to make our social action campaign for Crazies all about passage of the chemical security bill that has been sort of floundering in Congress for a couple of years now. And Greenpeace has a very active and engaged membership. I think they have 8 million members across the country. And working with them, we developed an advocacy campaign. It was a petition, as well as events in many of the opening markets of the Crazies, where we had Greenpeace volunteers in hazmat suits outside theaters advocating for a passage of this bill. And we, to an extent, educated moviegoers about this issue. Not a lot of them, but some of them. But most importantly, we had an NGO partner who really believed in the opportunity that a piece of popular media gave them to take a message that, to an extent, had been a Washington-based circular conversation and blow it out nationwide. The Crazies made a little money. We were very happy about that. But at the same time, the Crazies also enabled us to advocate for something we believed in, and to some extent, we're not sure how much, talk to an audience that we might not normally talk to. So that's that story. We also opened a movie a couple of weeks ago called Furry Vengeance. Furry Vengeance is a comedy with Brendan Fraser. Its target are young children, elementary school kids. It's about, in our mind, habitat protection. And what we did there was we created a habitat protection activity kit with the Endangered Species Coalition and with the National Wildlife Federation. And we have delivered this kit to 17,000 schools across the country, and 500,000 kids over the past couple of months have learned a bit about habitat protection by using this activity kit in classes. I will not tell you that we didn't have a second motive there as well, and that was to seed interest and awareness about the movie with that target audience. But that movie and that habitat protection activity kit, we think, went a ways to introducing kids to an aspect of their community life that they might not know about otherwise. I'll give you a couple of other examples of how we engage with narratives. One was The Kite Runner. Afghanistan, of 189 countries that report literacy rates, Afghanistan was the third worst in the world. So what we did was, because the book was so popular in the States, we started a campaign to build libraries and to train teachers in Afghanistan. And we worked with, again, a consortium of NGOs, and to this point, we've built 87 libraries and we've trained over 1,000 teachers in Afghanistan. That movie was the inspiration for that activity. Would it have happened otherwise? Maybe. Did the movie help shine a light on what was happening in that country? Yes, absolutely. And the final example I'll give you is The Soloist, which was Robert Downey and Jamie Foxx telling the true story of, oh gosh, I can't remember. Exactly, the Steve Lopez book, excuse me. A true story of an emotionally disturbed musician and a homeless classical musician in Los Angeles. And what we did there was we created a campaign working with Do Something, again an NGO that works with teenagers for the most part, and we created a drive where over 250,000 pairs of gently used jeans were collected and then distributed to teenage homeless centers around the country. That campaign occurred before the movie opened, which was interesting, and it was supported by Jamie Foxx, and that gave that campaign currency to the target audience of young adults. The actual audience for that movie was older, but a lot of our social action success on that film came before the film opened. So there's no book to any of this. It demands a lot of collaboration. It demands creativity from our NGO partners, from foundations, sometimes from corporate partners, from the filmmakers, and from talent, and our distributor partners. But when a narrative feature clicks, when it works, the social action results can be extraordinary.
Great work. It's wonderful to be with kindred spirits. We're all here because we're passionate about using media to create positive change. But I would be willing to bet that all of us have also been haunted by many of the same voices along the way. You know the ones I mean. The ones that go something like, this is foolish. This this is impractical. Maybe they're coming from your parents, or my favorite was one of my professors in business school. This is professional suicide. So I am wondering, how for real is that? The data seems scattered all over the place. Is traveling down this road as harrowing as it's made out to be? And I was very unsettled by these questions. And so I decided to put some analytical skills to work and gather all the information I could find and apply what I learned in business school, multivariable analysis, and at least discover, to the extent I could, the reality I was facing. And if it was ugly, I would just look the monster in the eyes. And hey, if it was better than I thought, I'd be a lot less worried and probably a lot happier. So I'd like to share with you what I've found so far. And I'm on the very beginning of this journey, but I believe that what I'm about to show you can not only be applied to fiction films, what we're talking about today, but be carried over to apply to all of the different media types that we're passionate about. And then eventually looking at transmedia projects, which are a great up-and-coming phenomenon. So I'm going to show you some of what I discovered. All right, so our goal is really to systematically understand the factors that are contributing to the success and the failure of social issue films. And if we can do this, it really positions us to help secure support for our projects, make more informed decisions along the way as we manage those projects, and then measure the results, a topic that is so exciting that Jessica did a great job on today. So there are a couple of ways to pursue this, and the tradition in the field so far has been heavily qualitative, evaluating patterns and story structure, and that is valuable and important, and we should all learn from that. But the area that is unexplored at this point are really the quantitative trends. So where did I go to get all of this info? You'd be surprised at what you can find. It's scattered all around, but it's readily available. The Motion Picture Association of America actually publishes all of the box office numbers for every single year. It's all publicly available. The total number of releases, the gross box office, the average box office, you can find it online. There is a resource called Studio System that's full of great information that we use a lot in entertainment. Box Office Mojo, you don't even need a subscription to that. You can go, and most of their numbers are reliable. Nielsen, this is important if you want to look at DVD sales or rentals, and now video on demand. And then we have started something at Meaningful Media called the Meaningful Mediapedia. And I am excited to share this with you because it is a resource we're building for our community. You will find this tremendously valuable, and it's really the data that's in the Meaningful Movies database that I am taking all of the findings from. So let's take a look at, what this is all about. The Mediapedia is a new web resource that aggregates, curates, and celebrates pro-social media. It has probably 120,000 data points collected already across 10 media types and 10 social issue types. And we'll go into more detail in a little bit about what those social issue icons mean. But for today's gathering, we're just going to focus on film and fiction film. So here are just some of the data points that we're tracking. And as you can take a look, for just the films, we already have 18,360, and it's growing. So, drum roll. The big finding, once we crunch the numbers, is that On average, and that's important, on average, social issue films perform above the average. Here are the MPAA numbers spread out over the years for the past 10 years. Now I'm going to show you the trend line for socially oriented, and this is fiction feature films. Wow. Who would have thought? This is huge, you guys. Huge. Maybe we can all start worrying less and have more fun. But really, what's our takeaway from this? Well,
Are you adding Avatar into that average?
Actually, I'm glad you asked, because that is anomalous, so I came prepared.
That was not a setup either.
Yeah, it is the elephant in the room. So, what does this mean for us? Well, there's good news and there's bad news here. And, I'm going to start with the bad news, actually. The bad news is that the results you're seeing for the social issue films just aren't that impressive to distributors. They're like venture capitalists. They want home runs. They don't want a first base hit or a second base hit. That's not the business model. So we can't walk in with this and say, all right, I have this killer screenplay. Well, I don't want to give away some of my next findings, but there are a lot of reasons to believe this film will be successful. To them, they are looking for returns of, 10 plus, 10 times the budget. So given that marketing budgets right now have been scaling up through the years, about 5 years ago it was 20 million, 3 years ago 25, I think we've hit 32, huge. The cost of a lot of the films that are social issue films are on par with that. And the distributors have simply begun to get out of that business. It's not worth it to them. So all of them have announced they're going to be releasing less films and they're more tentpole films. That's tough for us. On top of that, all of the specialty divisions are basically gone. I guess they're Sony classics, but that's about it. Vantage, Focus Features, Fox Searchlight, basically the distributors that would carry our social issue specialty films, all gone. Now, okay, we'll end the pity party and we'll look at the upside. Things go in cycles, 10 years ago, everyone was looking to make as many movies as they could that had potentials. There was capital everywhere. So I want to encourage everyone in the room that is passionate about this to keep this in your hip pocket, keep your chin up, and feel emboldened when the market comes back around and people are buying again. Okay, this is cool. So, how do different issues play at the box office? So say you are Gus Van Sant, you're thinking about making Milk, you're pitching this all over the place, you're getting the usual response, that doesn't sound marketable. Well, we'd look, the topic of that film would fit into the rights category. We can see that the average, and that's domestic box office, for rights films is $22.4 million. Milk, actually, the budget was $20 million. Domestic, it did 32, I believe, and international, 24. So it's starting to edge up there to where the distributors would look upon it favorably. But whatever film you're thinking about making, you really want to go into it eyes wide open with what's your theme issue, how does it play, how is it received. Some of this is not so surprising. Movies that are pure courtroom movies, we've seen enough of those. Environment films, you know, super hot. Economics, that category might puzzle you, but it's anything related to poverty. So like Pursuit of Happiness is in there. Okay. But this is very helpful, and we can drill down in this data and recombine it in huge number of ways. So for all of these main categories, we have about, on average, 15 subcategories. So if we just wanted to look at gay, lesbian right films, we could do that. If we wanted to look at human rights films, we could do that, like Hotel Rwanda, and look at those niche areas. All right, so findings for the future. What else can we do with this data set? I think it'll be very interesting to compare budgets to revenue. You know, it becomes chicken and egg kind of questions. Do social issue films simply not perform very well because they're given less budget in the first place? We'll see. Performance by secondary themes. A bunch of films are loaded with themes. Like when we hit Blindside, there's so much going on in there. I mean, you have poverty, you have homelessness, you have education, you have race. Oh, so what we did is we defined a primary theme, and then we have a whole set of secondary themes, and movies can be evaluated according to any of those. All right, some other interesting ways to look at this will be more qualitative measures, like aggregate review scores, like the ones you see on Rotten Tomatoes. Let's take a look and see how social issue films stand up with their Rotten Tomatoes scores based on their budgets, based on their box office. And one of the variables that will be hard to track down, but we'll be able to do it in a rough sense, is marketing dollars spent. You know, are these films just not as successful because the studios are unwilling to invest the kind of marketing dollars that they're investing in Iron Man 2? And what I think is tremendously high potential is this. Once we have this data and we can do the multivariable analysis, we will be able to look at the trends of these films vis-a-vis the micro and macro level impact that's going on in our society. So, can we pin down a causal relationship? No, we can't. But we can show correlations, and that could be a tremendously powerful thing for us. So here are a few key takeaways. As we leave, it would be great to consider about the importance of how developing a more systematic understanding of the interrelationship between variables that contribute to the success and failure needs to be an important next step for our field, and that we need to embrace it, not be afraid of the numbers and push them away. I bet we have a lot of liberal arts majors in the audience. But on the school Foundation's socially conscious media newsletter I get, there's been a whole bunch of articles recently about how liberal arts majors need to invade business schools. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you to all our panelists for these great presentations. I'm going to pose a few questions to the panel, and then I'd love to open it up for your questions. My first question is, we're here to talk about fiction films for change, and it's one of these very basic questions that I just think deserves articulation, which is, how can a fiction film make a difference? In the most basic sense, what kind of change are we talking about? Can the film alone have an impact, or does it not have an impact without these social outreach campaigns that accompany it?
Well, I think it's much more meaningful if there are campaigns so that I think a lot of the emotions and people saying, I want to get involved, because a lot of our programming had to do with how people could then go back to their communities, it becomes a much more meaningful exchange. I think what's really special about fiction films is the empathetic relationship, because oftentimes the documentary perspective is on that individual story, whereas because this is a fiction, there's a different point of entry and relating to the character.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have a different view?
Yeah, I think the first social action is seeing the movie. And with the majority of people who go to the movies, that's it. That's the engagement. That's where their engagement will stop. We produce social action campaigns, and we flatter ourselves that that we're reaching a broad swath of the American public. We're not. Those people who are genuinely interested in the issue, we have calls to action now at the end of all of our films. And with The Cove, where we had over 1 million people sign a petition to the Japanese ambassador and to Vice President Biden to stop the dolphin slaughter in Taiji, 9% of the audience who went to see The Cove did a text to action to send that letter out. Now, I was told that that was an extraordinarily large response rate, but that means as well that 91% of the audience didn't. And that's a pretty big number too. So the social action of watching a movie, becoming aware of an issue, learning about an issue area or about people you've never seen or heard of before, there's some significance to that in and of itself. That is not the Holy Grail as far as we're concerned, but it's a start.
Building actually on what you both said, and you've, both of you, actually all three of you have had certainly experience with documentary film. How do you feel that fiction is different from documentary in affecting people's attitudes and behaviors? And you were talking a little bit about that different relationship with the audience. Can you talk a little bit more about that particular thing, trying to drill down to what are the strengths of fiction films to impact an audience that are different or unique from documentary?
I think I'm executive producing a documentary now on Oscar Michaud called Oscar's Comeback, and about a small community in Gregory, South Dakota that's 98% white that celebrates their favored son, Oscar, and the kind of conflict that happens when African American scholars come to this town. You can go to the website to get more info. One of the tools with Precious that was really important in terms of the impact of the fiction was the novel. Interesting fact is, it was published in 1996, and for the last couple of years, it's been selling around 15,000 copies a year. Last year, it's sold over 1 million copies. But it was also part of a big campaign that, when we talk about early engagement, and I know this is a little divergent from your question, but I wanted to bring this up, is that we involved Random House, who had published the novel, when we were in pre-production. We invited them to the set, and when we started having screenings, we made certain that from the editor-in-chief on down to the salespersons for Barnes & Noble or Amazon came to see this film, because we knew that the base that had been developed for 13 years, both in education, where a lot of high school students were reading this, but just general fans that was a very important part of what was going to be audience building.
John or Emily, did you
Ask the question.
How is fiction different or unique in its ability to reach an audience different from documentary? Strengths, weaknesses, limitations?
Well, for starters, size of audience. An Inconvenient Truth grossed domestically $24 million. That was the first day 3-hour gross from Avatar. Not a lot. And yet, the impact of that movie was extraordinary. The opportunity with a narrative feature is that instead of opening in 2 theaters on the first weekend, it opens in 3,000 theaters on the opening weekend. And if you've got a social action campaign out there that's been seeded in advance of opening, the opportunity for impact is that much greater. Where there's a book out now called The Help. Have any of you guys read The Help or heard about The Help? It's a novel. It's a story of pre-civil rights or early '60s in the South. The lives of domestic workers in the South who essentially were employees at will, get fired at any moment, totally at the whim of their employers. And it's the personal story of several of these domestic workers, of these women. It is a very, very touching and compelling and well-told story. We may become involved in that movie. If we do, we know going in that there is a pre-sold audience of several million people who will have read that book and who will be looking for that movie, just as was the case with The Kite Runner. And we can take the issues of workers' rights, economic inequality, history lessons about the civil rights era, and we can blow that out with that movie. And that's something that will be inherent in the promotion of the movie, the marketing of the movie, and it's an exciting prospect.
Emily, did you have any thoughts?
I would like to contribute on this one. I know this audience is very doc-friendly, but keep in mind, fiction is so powerful. The limitations are those of your imagination, and it allows you to tap into people's innermost hopes and fears, the dynamics that drive us individually and societally in profound ways. So the potential for fiction works to shape perceptions, to create frameworks in which we view our world and hopefully behavior is just profound. And while the market is very down with feature films right now, television, it's the opposite. Television is expanding while feature films are contracting. There's a lot of potential and opportunity there. People love stories.
One or two more questions, and then, like I said, I'd really like to open it up to the room. Perhaps a bit of a tangent, but one thing we haven't talked about yet is how does putting recognizable actors, famous actors in major roles affect or change the ability of a film to deliver its message? You were talking a little bit about the casting of Precious, but there are other roles in the film, for example, that are cast with very recognizable names. I don't know if you want to take the question to start, and then we can open it to the others.
Well, this was the second time that we had worked with Monique. I think the casting, and we felt that she was the ultimate person who could play this horrific role of the Mother Mary. It was also in contrast to her public persona, which is quite jovial, and she's a comedian. So we knew that we would build on her base, but also we would build on the kind of interest to see her playing against type. And the casting is comprised of unexpected turns, like Mariah Carey with no makeup, or Lenny Kravitz as the nurse. But then there are also discoveries of, the young girls in the classroom, people that, I think there's some new exciting stars that are going to come out of the film who were not known before. But they had to do two things. They had to commit to the process and to strip down and to not come with bodyguards and to be ready to go on this journey of authenticity. And ultimately, you know, if you're a great singer, as Miss Carey or Lenny Kravitz is, you're a great interpreter. And they had done acting before, they had an interest in it, and we thought that, yes, they're going to help us to market this film, but they're also really good in these roles. It was not done because, like, oh, they'll get people in, but it was like, no, we see something in their artistry, in what they do, that we feel can translate from music to film, and at the same time aid in getting the word out and building upon their fan bases. Because as we were putting the film together, we didn't know that when we went to Sundance that Oprah Winfrey and Tyler Perry would sign on as executive producers to help get the word out. We went in going like, well, maybe we're going to go right to DVD, but we're just going to do this anyway. But always building community and partnerships, whether it's with GEMS, an organization that works with young girls in New York, or just a variety of communities, through the process of making the film, testing it, we were bringing people in and making them a part of our family to as I like to call it, beat the drum.
I think stars are not a predictor of box office success. I think they enable producers to hedge their bets to an extent. They enable producers to get films financed, but they don't necessarily mean that films are going to make money. We did The Kite Runner, and 60% of the dialogue in that movie was in Farsi. There were no stars in that movie that any American audience goer would know. That movie performed well. It didn't perform brilliantly, but it performed well enough in the States and better internationally so that we ended up making some money on The Kite Runner. Stars had no bearing on the box office of that movie. The book did, but the stars didn't. We made The Soloist. Robert Downey and Jamie Foxx are in that. Robert Downey had just come off Iron Man and Tropic Thunder, an action film and a comedy. Here he was playing straight. He was playing a newspaper reporter from the LA Times. Jamie Foxx was a stand-up who got his film bona fides playing Ray Charles, among others. But here was a serious film with two actors who didn't necessarily have reputations as dramatic actors necessarily, at least lately. And that film didn't perform as well as we would hope it would have. It was a serious movie. It came out at a time when the country was in a deep recession, and the audience was not ready to go and be bummed out. It's a wonderful movie, but it's a movie that didn't perform at the box office the way we hoped it might. Are stars necessary in order for features to work so that social action can work? Look at Avatar. You know, the brilliance of Cameron as a technologist is really the key to the success of that movie, not any star. I'll give one more example to contradict what I just said, and that is George Clooney in Good Night and Good Luck. That was a passion project for Clooney. It took him a long time to get funding for that movie. And what he did was he put together this extraordinary all-star cast of people where there was no one singular star. Even David Strathairn, who played Morrow, was not a well-known star. But the quality of the filmmaking, the quality of the writing, quality of the directing, all of that took a film that was an ensemble cast and delivered an important message and turned it into something uniquely successful. So I will leave you with the words of James Goldman. James Goldman, who wrote The Adventures in the Screen Trade. Do I have the right guy? William Goldman. William Goldman. He famously said about Hollywood, "Nobody knows anything." And that is so true. You know, and I listen with great respect to the numbers that were quoted, and it's hard to get behind them to any great extent because movies are a total crapshoot at all times, whether it's a documentary or a feature. You got Warner Brothers who says, we're going to put out 12 movies a year. And if one of those movies breaks big, they've had a wonderful year, okay? Look at Paramount last year with, what was the one that they picked up for $15,000? And
Paranormal Activity.
Paranormal Activity. They picked it up for $15,000, and it did over $100 million at the box office. There was no superstar in that movie. It just struck a chord. So great filmmaking is an essential, but luck and timing are essentials as well, and you can't predict those.
Since we only have 15 minutes, I'm going to open the room for questions. I think we have microphones on around, so raise your hand and the mics will come to you.
I don't think so.
Hello? My name is Melissa. I'm with Discovery Channel Global Education Partnership, a long name, for a nonprofit organization that was founded and is spearheaded by Discovery Channel, known for obviously nonfiction media. And primarily our work has been documentary over the last 13 years. But I have a comment and then a question. One is that even though we have been working in documentary, the foundation of all of our projects really starts with the community and finding out what the needs of our communities are. Our audiences being in Africa and Latin America primarily. And in trying to develop a project about the science of HIV and how it works inside the body, we did a lot of initial research that looked at how to talk about science of HIV with groups of people in a continent where, you know, our audience may not have a basic education. And what we found was that a narrative was suggested and that a fiction film would be best. So even though we were working in documentary, we had that idea to do narrative film and fictional film from our audience and asking how would they best receive that information. I thought that was really interesting. And the other thing is, you know, even though we typically work in documentary, the translation to working in fiction film has been really interesting and I think has opened up for us a whole new world of possibilities in terms of the way that we can work. But my question is actually with regard to financing. What are the challenges and opportunities in fundraising for a fictional film versus documentary? And what does that look like for us, especially when we're used to going and getting money and talking about film from a documentary approach versus fiction? And if you have any suggestions, thanks.
Flexibility. Oftentimes when I work with filmmakers, they say it has to be made for this amount of money. In the current climate and landscape that we all have to operate in, what I tell filmmakers now is that, yes, let's have our dream budget, but let's also have budget B and budget C. Because oftentimes it's about getting the story told. It might not be with all the bells and whistles, and sometimes the more stripped down version can actually be the more exciting one because of the ingenuity that has to come in terms of creating it. So yes, it's great to find an angel like we did, but oftentimes, you know, and it's also, you know, we talk about precious. I worked on this movie for 5 years, so it didn't transpire overnight. So I think it's patience and flexibility and having at least budget A, B, C, and possibly D.
I think the work that you guys at Discovery are doing internationally is, where are you? I can't find you. Oh, okay. Did you sit down? Oh, okay. I think the work is really excellent and important, and congratulations. And I understand that you're funded to an extent by Discovery, but you're also funded by foundations, and you should be better. You should continue to be funded and well-funded because of what you do. There's some analogy, I think, to the work that you do and what BBC World Trust does, and the idea of bringing narratives into that are country-specific, whether it's, and it's primarily on television and on radio, is remarkably impactful. A citizen in Kenya or name the country, South Africa, is much more likely to be moved and informed by a narrative than they are by a documentary. A good story, well told, is something that is going to pull you in, and the opportunity to create long-form narratives, serialized narratives overseas, internationally, I think is a tremendous opportunity that I think now more and more being taken advantage and is being funded not by commercial filmmakers but by foundations who want to talk to audiences that they never get to otherwise. So, as that relates domestically in the U.S. to foundation funding and other funding for features, I can't speak to that because, in my experience, docs are the vehicle of choice for foundations. I think they will get wiser as time goes by and see those opportunities, but there's something, God forbid I should say this, but there's something somewhat predictable in terms of the delivery of information that one can get from a doc that one cannot necessarily predict from a feature. And I think that foundations worry about that because they're funding against a particular issue. And they want to know that the information is delivered in a way that is as close to truthful as possible. Harder to guarantee that in a feature. So that may be part of the dilemma.
Are you looking for content? What do you mean by that? Well, for example, there's an organization called Buy Kids, and what they do is they send mentors from the States to different countries to work with young filmmakers around the world. So one of their first projects was shot in Africa. It was written and directed. It's a doc by a 16-year-old who lost his parents to HIV, and he is talking to his peers who also have had a loss of family members. So if I can speak to you afterwards if that might be something you're interested in looking at.
Great. Thank you for that. Let's have the next question, please.
I'm Arthur Kanagas with One Films, and I just wanted to say that when I first read about Jeff Skoll telling the story of how when he was a kid he had this passion for telling stories that could really touch the world, and how he partly helped found eBay to make that possible, it gives me terrific hope to see a company like yours where Jeff said the bottom line, if people come to him and say, we think this film will lose $1 million, he says, well, will putting $1 million into a nonprofit working on that issue have more impact, or will this? And if so, he's willing to take that risk, which is panning out because you're staying in business, which is fantastic. And I guess my question for you is, how much does your division involved with the social action? Is that an afterthought after the films, or are you involved at the very beginning and sometimes bringing films to participant, or in helping, in saying to participant, okay, here's a crucial issue, here's a film that can help touch that issue?
Both ways. We get over 1,200 submissions a year on the doc and the narrative side, and we probably are involved with or put out about 6 or 8 movies a year. So the winnowing down is pretty substantial. The green light process at Participant is pretty democratic. We have an executive committee of 9 people, and we have to have consensus among us: social action, business affairs, marketing. The head of docs weighs in on decisions about which narratives to greenlight. So unless there's consensus, we don't make the movie. Unless we believe that it's a great story with a great creative team, the business aspects, the deal works for us, we have a chance to come out, and the social action is an issue that is actionable. That is something that we think we can engage the public on. All of those elements have to conspire together successfully in order for us to greenlight a movie.
I'm being told we have 5 more minutes, so let's see if we can get to 1 or 2 more questions, ideally.
No, it's all right. My name's Roy. I'm an independent producer. I'm curious if you could just comment a little bit more on social engagement, supplemental social engagement efforts that work to broaden the audience of the interested and engaged. Your initial comment, I think, John, you said that 9% response rate at the theater was considered good. That to me sounds like you're basically talking to the converted. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about efforts to expand that audience, to use the film as a springboard to expand the audience of the engaged, and if you have any examples of efforts that actually worked, love to hear them.
Yeah, that is a good comment. And the documentary audience especially is an audience that is used to going to documentaries, basically comes into the theater agreeing with the premise of the doc before the story is laid out. And if we purely speak to them, to that audience, we're not doing our job right. The movie has to be, in order to succeed, in order for social action to succeed, a catalyst for a larger conversation. That's why we work with literally, in all of our movies collectively, we probably work with about 175 different NGOs. On Food Inc., we work with 24 NGOs to get the messaging out, not only about the movie, but about the social action. Of course, we want people to go to the movie, but I'll guarantee you that, 20 or 30 times the number of people who went to that movie became aware of the social action through the outreach that we were able to do with our NGO partners. Other thing is, if the movie works on any reasonable level theatrically, the impact of that movie to a larger audience is exponential. An Inconvenient Truth is a good example of that. This film was seen by 5 million people. We've been able to track that there were over 1 billion people who actually became aware of the movie around the world. Now, that's a big number, but the movie and the issue became part of the zeitgeist as a result of this momentum that occurred when the film broke and then became part of the sort of national conversation. So in success, we absolutely reach a much broader audience than the pure theatrical audience, but we don't always succeed.
Great. Do we have time for one more question? We do. Last question, please.
Hi, my name is Dan Curl. I'm an associate producer working here in DC. My question is that, as we've distinguished here, documentary has a lion's share of social issues and call to action. Do you think that the fictional marketplace is hesitant to fund stories or buy stories, fictional feature stories, because the doc world kind of has it covered, quote unquote?
That's a good question. Emily, do you want to?
I would like to hop in. There is an example I'd like to share with you of something that is happening in television that's very exciting. And I'm bringing this up because it's using fiction series television as a conduit for behavioral messaging. And you might be surprised to hear that the show is Law and Order SVU. But they have, and you might have noticed, even if you're a casual viewer, topics for virtually every episode, and they've formed a partnership with participate.org to enlist stakeholders with an interest in the topic to take action. So they had one episode was about HIV deniers, interestingly enough, and what the rationale behind that position is or is not, however you define that, and the harm that it was causing from a health standpoint, the negative health impact. And so I'm bringing this up as an example of something that is tremendously exciting that fiction is doing. And by the way, NBC has a behavioral initiative you might have read about in the New York Times recently that just has the potential to reach so many more people in a direct way. And I believe that and I have made and am making a documentary, so I can say this, we tend to exercise our documentary muscles more quickly and easily, perhaps because it's within reach. We can raise that amount of money. We can find a way to distribute it, however we're defining that. And we might want to, I'd like to posit, raise the stakes a bit and try to get more of our product and programming on mainstream television.
Great. I think we're going to have to end here, but I want to thank the panelists once more for this very